Welcome. I'm Scott Hodge, President of the Tax Foundation. Thank you for joining us for another Tax Foundation discussion on the impact of COVID-19. Last time we drilled down on how U.S. states are responding to the COVID-19 crisis. Today, we're going to focus on federal tax policy and ask an important question. Now that we're beginning to see the economy open, how can we put the U.S. economy on a path to a strong economic recovery? And I'm joined today by my colleague, Karl Smith, our Vice President for Federal and Economic Policy. Karl, let me start with a simple question, and that is, recognizing a number of states have already beginning to open up some of their economic activity slowly. It's obvious we have a long way to go to return to normal. And that kind of brings us to the broader topic that we're going to cover today. When is the right time to start focusing on long-term comprehensive reform versus what the economy needs in the short term? How do you balance those needs? And then, is there a danger in waiting too long?
Right. So I think there are two distinct needs that have to be addressed. So as long as the stay-at-home orders are in place, companies are going to have serious cash flow issues. They're not allowed to operate. Many of them are not allowed to operate at all, or if they are, they have to operate in a reduced capacity. And so Congress chose to address that with a combination of increased lending through Federal Reserve and the payroll protection program for small businesses. The payroll protection program has received mixed reviews, and there has been some talk about using other policies, maybe a broader payroll tax cut or even a negative payroll tax to supplement it. But at this point, we think that it's probably better to fix some of the issues that are with the payroll protection program, get through the stay-at-home orders, and then once they're passed, it'll be time to focus on long-term growth, and that takes on a very different form. So I think for long-term growth, what businesses need, even more than cash flow to keep themselves afloat, is they need new investment. And they need new investment for at least two different reasons. One is that the environment that we're going to be in, even though we're past the stay-at-home orders, is going to be one that's really challenging. And so to be maximally productive, businesses are going to have to make new investments in like health-related capital spending. Some of that could be things you could imagine as changing the airflow systems within their building. Some of it will be health monitoring. Some businesses are in the business of health, and they'll need to expand capacity greatly. That'll all require lots of investment. We might also see supply chain shifts around the world in response to the crisis, and that'll require new investments. It might actually mean a lot of factories or people who make critical inputs coming back to America. So for that reason, we need new investment. The second reason we need new investment is because overall investment collapsed during the crisis. Obviously, some of that is because it's difficult to work, but that's also typical of a recession. What we see is that when sales are down, businesses really cut back on investment. And what typically takes an economy out of a recession is when investment gets going again. And so in order to keep this from turning into a prolonged recession, we've got to get investment restarted. When investment restarts, that means that companies are buying more equipment and more tools. That increases manufacturing jobs, and that really gets the economy moving. And so in our analysis, the most powerful thing that we can do to increase investment, to get the economy moving, to prepare for the environment that we're going to be in for however long, 12 months, 18 months, is full expensing. Full expensing allows companies to deduct the cost of their investments immediately as opposed to over time. That makes it far cheaper for them to make rapid changes in the amount of investment that they have. And that's exactly what they're going to need to do right now.
Well, obviously, we're in uncharted waters, and the economy's policymakers have never been in this before. And what specific challenges do you see that we should expect to face as the economy begins to reopen?
Um, so like I said, I think one of the biggest challenges is around providing, that safe environment for workers. I think a lot of the focus in the media is on what the government can do, testing, things like that. But we should be mindful of how much it's going to be private businesses doing things to expand. right, or doing things to sort of to adjust and make people feel safe. Some of the research we have shows that like the actual closure of the economy started before the stay-at-home order, started around the second weekend in March when the NBA closed. Lots of businesses started to close around the country. Similar, we've had some states like Georgia start to open up, but things have been disappointing because their retailers haven't found enough customers. And so we're going to need local solutions to deal with that. And a particular challenge that we might have is that even though we provide these incentives for investment, at least at first, it's going to be hard for some businesses to get financing. And so one of the things that we recommend for that is allowing companies to sort of cash out some of the tax assets that they have. And so some companies are carrying things like NOLs, which are net operating losses from future years. Some companies have depreciation on the books and maybe even tax credits. These are things that they would be allowed to apply to their taxes in future years and save them money. If we instead allow them to get that cash up front, that'll provide them with some financing that they're going to need to make these types of investments. And it'll also have a low cost for the Treasury because they won't be taking those deductions or allowances in the future. And so they get more money now, but they'll pay more in taxes later. And so it's almost a net wash to the Treasury, but it can help the companies have a lot more financing right now when they need it the most.
Well, certainly as I read the news, I'm seeing an awful lot of uh, policies being proposed from all corners, naturally. What are you recommending to policymakers? How should they think about the next steps and the policies they should take for the long term?
Well, the first thing that we want to do is guard against temporary policies that have a minimal impact on the economy. Something that's really popular are tax rebates. You know, sending just checks to households. That might have helped some people during the shutdown phase, but our research shows that the Bush and Obama tax cuts that were done during a normal recession didn't have that much effect on the economy. Most of that money was spent, was saved rather than spent in the economy. And so it had little impact in increasing growth. What we want to do is get policymakers to focus on long-term solutions that are going to encourage a lot of investment now that's going to keep the economy growing over time. And so to that end, we're actually encouraged that, you know, some of our policies like full expensing are being considered by the White House and Congress. A little bit less encouraging are some policies like I said, the payroll tax cut. There may be some support for businesses that's needed, but our analysis shows that dollar for dollar, the payroll tax cut has much smaller effect on growth than something like full expensing. And in general, things that encourage investment are going to have a much more powerful effect for every tax dollar you forego than checks that are just sent to consumers or broad-based tax cuts for businesses based on payroll.
Well, you know, you mentioned expensing, and of course, we've done an awful lot of research and analysis on that. I had a question from a reporter the other day asking, well, what does expensing do for workers? That sounds like it's so pro-business. Uh, and they asked, you know, well, how are you going to get bipartisan support for something like that? And I pointed to our recent study on the effects, the economic effects of expensing, and thought that it would be a good selling point for lawmakers that represent Rust Belt states and manufacturers. And perhaps you could share some of the results of that study because it seems like a pretty powerful argument in favor of the policy.
Right. So our results show that moving to full expensing would grow long-term GDP by 5%. It would increase wages by 4%, and it actually create 1 million permanent jobs. So that's not just a burst of jobs for the recovery, but those are 1 million more jobs that are going to last even after the economy comes back. And having a larger economy, having higher wages, having more people employed, that actually causes the recovery to happen faster because foreseeing that they're going to have more money in the future, people are able to spend more money now. The direct investment that businesses do also has a particular effect on the Rust Belt states that you have. Because when businesses buy more equipment, that means that manufacturers have more orders, and so they hire more workers. They also, because they're getting more orders, might have to expand their facilities. Having full expensing in there allows them to do that faster. When they expand their facilities, not only are they able to take on more workers, but that still requires, construction workers or other workers to help them expand. And so these provisions that increase investment have a particularly strong effect on the sort of like manufacturing heart of America that I think has suffered a lot, in this period.
Hmm. Well, I think everybody knows that the government's been spending a lot to try to keep the economy afloat. Somewhere in the neighborhood of over $3 trillion in support, which when you add it to the deficit that was already built into the budget, now we're looking at a deficit of well over 4 trillion, which is pushing the debt up to what, 20 trillion or so. How do we balance these needs for economic growth with what are inevitably going to be revenue needs to try to lower the debt? And how important is the deficit right now as a focal point relative to policies for growth?
Right, and so we recognize the debt issue. So the way economists usually think about debt is as the ratio of debt to GDP, and that will likely surpass the record that we set in World War II. So it is a very large amount of debt. But the thing to remember is, while the absolute amount of debt is important in that equation, GDP is too. And so to get that ratio down, you also need to grow the economy. That's one reason we think that right now the focus should be on growth. In addition, even if you wanted to lower the deficit, it's extremely difficult to do that while the economy is weak. While the economy is weak, tax revenues are going to be lower, and in a weak economy, a weak economy is always going to promote more spending, right? Any type of crisis of this nature is going to promote more spending. And so to get us out of that situation, we need to return to growth. That's going to increase revenues, that's going to decrease the demand for spending, and that's going to naturally put us in a stronger position to reduce the deficit, in addition to increasing GDP, which automatically lowers the debt to GDP ratio. So both trying to increase the denominator and decrease the numerator, you need growth to be able to do that. We'd also, as we come out of this, when Congress starts to think about what it needs to do, we'd remind them that in past crises, the research shows that if you're going to reduce the debt, it's easier on the recovery and it has faster growth if you do that through spending reduction and cost saving measures than if you do it through tax increases. And so to the extent that Congress can find cost savings and reduce the deficit that way, that's going to allow us to have faster growth than if we turn to increasing taxes.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, and I think I shared with you the other day some research studies that have been done at the international level, looking at the way that countries have responded to these sort of debt deficit crises, either through spending reductions or tax increases. And looking at the history of those things, the economists found that countries that reduced spending in order to deal with a deficit debt crisis produced better economic results than those that dealt with it by raising taxes. And I think that's a pretty good lesson for the United States. Let me wrap up with a question that is kind of an interesting one. What kind of lessons have we learned about the structure of the tax system? How can we improve the tax system so that it's better prepared to deal with these kind of crises? Some people have pointed to some of the decisions that were made in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, for instance, which restricted the ability of companies to carry back NOLs. And of course, much of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was temporary, so that had an impact on certainty. And so what would you recommend in terms of either restructuring or the kinds of policies that would improve both maybe the resilience of the economy, but also the resilience of the tax system?
Right. So you've mentioned the carryback of NOLs, and so those are losses, and those are losses that companies sustain, and that can be important for cushioning the effect of a recession in this way. Companies during this crisis will lose a lot of money. Before the TCJA, what they could do is apply that to taxes they had paid in previous years and get some of the money back that they paid. That which would have eased the burden of the losses that they're making now. The TCJA disallowed that and said they could carry losses forward and apply them to future years, which would help them in the future, but wouldn't give them any cash right now. So fortunately, Congress passed the CARES Act. It temporarily allows a little bit of carryback, but what would prepare us for future crises is if we could carry back losses permanently, and if we could carry back them further and at a higher level. And so that's one of the strong types of provisions that we can do to make the economy itself a little bit more robust, even when we have, future crises, which, we hope we don't, but we know that we will. And so that'll prepare us for that. At the same time, we do know that countries which are more tilted towards income taxes, and in particularly income taxes on the higher end, tend to have a little bit less stable tax system. So to the extent that you're worried about large deficits occurring during recession, being more hooked up to the income taxes rather than consumption-based taxes is going to increase that problem.
That's a very interesting observation. And of course, the OECD has pointed out, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, their research has pointed out that corporate income taxes and personal income taxes are the most harmful for economic growth. One, because capital is very mobile, and also taxes impact people's decision making to work and invest. And naturally, during economic downturns, those are the least stable revenue sources. So that's a good reminder, I think, for policymakers. Well, Karl, thank you very much for your observations and insights, and especially thanks to your team for some of the tremendous work that they've been doing over the last couple of weeks, analyzing every aspect of the COVID-19 response. The modeling they've done, the analysis they've done has been particularly helpful for both taxpayers, but also, as we've seen, lawmakers in trying to understand not only the impact of their own policies, but where to go next. So thank you again for the work that you've been doing. And I do want to remind viewers that you can stay updated on our latest research at taxfoundation.org. And you can subscribe to our regular updates at taxfoundation.org/subscribe. Thank you very much. I'm Scott Hodge, tuning out. We'll see you next time for another Tax Foundation discussion on tax policy.